The bells of Westminster had rung out many weddings before, but on that autumn morning of 1396, something felt unnatural about the pageantry. The air in the abbey was chilled, breath misting in the stone vaults, while sunlight filtered through coloured glass and struck the polished armour of courtiers waiting in uneasy silence. At the altar stood Richard II, 29 years old, regal in every detail, the gold thread of his robe catching the light, his bearing that of a king who knew he was both admired and feared. But when the heavy oak doors opened and the bride appeared, a murmur rippled through the crowd. For it was not a woman in her teens or 20s who walked toward the altar, but a child. A small hand, pale as wax, rested inside Richard's gloved palm, and her crown of pearls seemed to weigh down her delicate braids. She was only 6 years old, Isabella of Valois, Princess of France. The priest steadied himself at the altar rail. He had seen girls of 12 or 13 wed before, even heard vows spoken by frightened young voices still soft with childhood. But this was different. Isabella barely reached the king's elbow. When she curtsied, her little knees wobbled under the gold cloth of her gown. She was, quite literally, a child queen. And yet, no one flinched. The nobles whispered, yes, but no one openly protested. They all understood why they were here. Marriage was not about love. It was about power, especially in a century where plague had halved populations, where kings could be toppled overnight, where alliances mattered more than sentiment. A treaty inked on parchment could be torn. A marriage bound by the church was infinitely harder to undo. Richard's voice, when he spoke his vows, carried not the lust of a man marrying a bride, but something closer to paternal gentleness. Chroniclers would later note he bent down toward her, softening his tone as if reassuring a frightened daughter. The vows were solemn, but the subtext clear. This marriage would not be consummated until Isabella came of age. For now, she would be raised as England's queen in name, a political guarantee of peace between two nations bloodied by the 100 Years' War. Yet the sight unsettled even those accustomed to politics. A girl too small to wield a goblet was being crowned with responsibility she could not possibly grasp. To the commoners watching from the shadows, it was both wondrous and disturbing. A child stepping into the gilded cage of monarchy. As the mass continued, Isabella's large dark eyes roamed over the abbey, its towering Gothic arches, its endless rows of flickering candles, the glitter of jewels on velvet robes. She did not cry. She seemed more curious than afraid, and that strange calmness made the scene all the more haunting. Was she absorbing the meaning of the moment, or simply bewildered, a child lost in ceremony beyond comprehension? Outside, England and France still reeled from decades of war. Villages had been burned, treasuries emptied, fields soaked in blood. The Black Death had stalked Europe only half a century before, and memory of its devastation hung heavy over all political decisions. To the French, Isabella was a token of reconciliation. The flesh and blood promised that their kingdom's daughters would heal wounds better than swords could. To the English, she was a dowry worth hundreds of thousands of francs, and, more importantly, the assurance of a truce long enough to let a weary land breathe. But for the priest at the altar rail, the thought lingered. This tiny girl's fate was now tied to forces older and larger than she could ever understand. He raised his hand, blessed the union with a steady voice, and pronounced them husband and wife. The words echoed up into the vaults like an incantation. The congregation responded with dutiful amens, but the air felt heavy with unease. When the choir sang, Richard squeezed Isabella's hand, guiding her forward as if to shield her from the stairs, and yet nothing could shield her from history. She was no longer Isabella of France. She was Isabella of England, Queen Consort, before she could even write her name. And though everyone told themselves the arrangement was practical, that the marriage was symbolic, that no harm would come to the girl, until she grew deep inside, there was an awareness, a dangerous awareness. Childhood had been stolen from her. From this moment on, her life would belong not to dolls or games, but to crowns, treaties, and the ruthless game of kings. What would become of her in a court where loyalty shifted like sand, where her husband himself was not secure on his throne? No one could answer. They could only watch the little queen disappear into the tide of history, swallowed by velvet and gold, and wonder, would she be England's saviour, or its next casualty? Isabella of Valois entered the world on the 9th of November, 1389, in the Louvre Palace of Paris. Not yet the museum of glass pyramids we know today, but a sprawling medieval fortress of cold stone walls, echoing halls, and chambers rich with tapestries, incense, and intrigue. To the court of France, her birth was not simply the arrival of another royal child. She was the eldest daughter of King Charles VI of France and Queen Isabella of Bavaria, and therefore a jewel in a crown already splintering under the weight of madness, war, and ambition. Her father, King Charles VI, would come to be remembered with one of the cruelest epithets bestowed on any monarch: Charles the Mad. At moments, he was capable, even beloved, leading campaigns, presiding over councils, extending patronage to artists and scholars. But his lucidity never lasted. In sudden episodes, the king's mind would unravel. He would forget who he was, fail to recognize his own wife or children, or dissolve into violent paranoia. On more than one occasion, he lashed out against his own servants, believing himself beset by assassins. At his worst, he claimed his body was made of glass, so fragile that even the slightest touch might shatter him into 1,000 splinters. He sometimes refused to bathe, wandering the palace in filth and rags, or fell into a frozen silence that lasted for weeks. Imagine being a small girl in such a court one day, being showered with affection, perched on her father's knee as he laughed and gave her sweets, and the next being rushed away by anxious servants as that same father crouched in a corner screaming, or stood rigid for hours, convinced that movement meant death. For Isabella, childhood was a kaleidoscope of tenderness and terror. Her mother, Queen Isabella of Bavaria, was no less formidable. Intelligent, politically shrewd, and strikingly beautiful, Isabeau understood that her children were bargaining chips in the great chess match of European power. Though she cared for Isabella, she also measured her daughter's worth in terms of alliance and dowry. The queen herself had navigated treacherous waters. Forced into marriage at a young age, she had learned to survive the chaos of her husband's mind by wielding her own influence, building factions, and cultivating loyalists at court. For Isabella, her mother was both protector and strategist. Life in the Louvre was a paradox. It glittered with luxury silks imported from Italy, meals served on gold plate, halls alive with minstrels and poets. Yet behind the velvet curtains lurked constant fear. Fear of the king's instability, fear of ambitious nobles circling the throne, fear of English raids that could sweep across northern France at any moment. In that sense, Isabella was born into two worlds at once, one dripping with opulence, the other poisoned by instability. Her earliest years would have been spent in the care of nurses and governesses, where lessons of etiquette, prayer, and language were woven into daily routines. But in her young eyes, the contradictions of her parents' rule could not be hidden. She would grow up knowing that a king could be powerful and powerless at the same time, and that a queen's love could never be separated from her calculations. The Valois dynasty itself stood on precarious ground. The 100 Years' War had raged for decades, crippling both France and England. French peasants starved, English coffers bled dry. Isabella's family was at the center of a storm that had already outlived one generation and threatened to consume the next. And in the heart of that storm, the 6-year-old princess, small, delicate, with wide dark eyes, was about to become the very embodiment of peace. From the moment of her birth, courtiers would have looked at her and thought not of toys, songs, or innocent games, but of treaties, alliances, and the fragile scaffolding that held kingdoms together. Every gesture, every word, every betrothal whispered in the smoky chambers of ambassadors would be tied to her fate. Isabella of Valois was not born for herself. She was born for France, and soon she would be traded to England. And yet beneath the crown and the treaty she would one day bear, she was still a child trying to understand why her father sometimes looked at her with love and sometimes with terror, why her mother kissed her forehead with one hand while signing diplomatic letters with the other, and why the palace itself seemed to breathe with secrets. For Isabella, childhood was never truly her own. It was a rehearsal for history. To understand why a child of 6 was offered up as Queen of England, one must step into the long shadow of the 100 Years' War. By the time Isabella was born, the conflict between France and England had already dragged on for more than 6 decades, turning entire regions into wastelands. Villages in northern France lay in ashes from English raids. Peasants fled their fields, leaving crops to rot. In England, noble families bled their fortunes to fund endless campaigns across the Channel. Both kingdoms were exhausted, yet neither could yield, for what was at stake was not just land, but legitimacy itself, the crown of France. By the 1392nd, the war had hardened into something more than a dynastic quarrel. It had become a question of national survival, of identity, of pride. But as decades of fighting blurred into one another, whispers of peace began to stir in both courts. The people were weary, coffers were empty, and the memory of plague, the Black Death, that had claimed nearly half of Europe, still haunted every decision. Was there not, some wondered, a way to bind 2 kingdoms in something stronger than parchment, something sanctified by God? It was at this precise moment that the personal life of Richard II intersected with the fate of Europe. Richard, still young at 29, had lost the anchor of his reign. His wife, Anne of Bohemia, known to history as Good Queen Anne, she was adored by the English people for her gentleness and charity. More unusually, Richard had genuinely loved her. Chroniclers note their marriage was warm, affectionate, and free of scandal, a rarity in royal unions of convenience. Her death in 1394, likely from plague, devastated him. Richard sank into mourning so deep that he reportedly had her palace, Sheen Manor, destroyed because he could no longer bear the sight of the place where she had died. In his grief, he resisted calls to remarry, feeling it would betray her memory. But his advisors pressed him relentlessly. A widowed king without an heir was a dangerous king. Nobles grew restless. Factions sharpened their knives. Richard could not afford sentiment, not when the survival of the realm was at stake. It was in this vacuum that the French proposal arrived. Ambassadors from Charles VI's court carried with them a proposition bold enough to silence even Richard's critics. The hand of the French king's eldest daughter, Isabella of Valois, in marriage. Alongside her came promises that glittered like treasure. France offered a dowry of 800,000 gold francs, a staggering sum that could refill England's depleted treasury. More importantly, they promised a 28-year truce span so long it might raise an entire generation free of war. The idea was seductive. A child bride, yes, but a living symbol that France and England could bind their wounds not with swords, but with kinship. To the French, it was a gesture of reconciliation. To Richard, it was a way to stabilize his rule, refill his coffers, and perhaps, in Isabella's innocence, find a strange kind of solace after the loss of Anne. But not all were convinced. Even in an age where girls were betrothed in early adolescence, Isabella's age was shockingly young. She was only 6, barely old enough to learn her letters. Many at court worried that such a union would scandalize Europe, painting England as desperate. Others argued it made perfect sense. By the time Isabella grew to womanhood, she would be entirely English in her loyalties, raised in Richard's court as both pupil and queen. The debates grew heated. Some nobles saw only the dowry and the truce, an end to bleeding coffers and endless campaigns. Others bristled, insisting Richard should remarry a woman of proper age. one capable of bearing heirs immediately. "What use is a child bride?" they muttered, "when the kingdom needs an heir today, not in 10 years." Richard himself seemed moved less by the political calculus than by something subtler. When presented with a miniature portrait of Isabella, court observers noted a flicker of emotion in his face. Perhaps he saw in her wide, dark eyes not just a political pawn, but a child who would need protection. Perhaps, whispered some, the childless king longed to be both husband and father. Whatever his reasoning, Richard pressed forward. The negotiations stretched for months. Every clause of the treaty was debated. Isabella would retain French ladies in waiting. She would be allowed correspondence with her family. The marriage would remain unconsummated until she came of age, explicitly written into the treaty to silence critics. Meanwhile, seamstresses in Paris prepared a trousseau heavy with gold embroidery, and tutors began teaching Isabella English words she could not yet comprehend. She was told, in the gentle way adults tell children hard truths, that she was to marry a great king across the sea. Did she imagine fairy tales, castles, and crowns? Or did she already sense the weight of expectation pressing on her small shoulders? We cannot know. What we do know is that while she played with her dolls in Paris, men in council chambers sealed her fate with wax and ribbons. Thus, the stage was set. A grieving king, a child princess, and 2 kingdoms desperate for peace. What came next would unfold not once, but twice 2 ceremonies, 2 crowns, 2 moments where Isabella stepped forward as both child and queen. The union between England and France was not a single day's affair, but a carefully choreographed series of ceremonies designed to convince the world that this fragile alliance was more than words. Isabella's marriage to Richard II unfolded twice, as though one ceremony alone could not bear the weight of 2 kingdoms' hopes. The first took place on the 31st of October, 1396, in the English-held port of Calais. The choice of location was no accident. Calais, perched on French soil yet firmly under English control, was a liminal space neither wholly French nor wholly English. A neutral stage for a performance in which neither side wished to appear submissive. Within the stone halls of Calais Castle, banners of the fleur-de-lis and the 3 lions of England hung side by side, the air thick with the salt of the sea and the murmur of rival languages. Isabella was only 7. Her gown was spun from cloth of gold, embroidered so heavily with pearls that it seemed almost to weigh her down. Chroniclers remark that she required attendants to help her walk, her little hands clutching the fabric to keep from stumbling. Richard, tall and imposing beside her, bent to meet her gaze as the vows were spoken. When she faltered at the sight of so many foreign faces watching, he is said to have lifted her chin gently, as though reminding her that she was not just a child, but now a queen. This first ceremony was small, intimate, attended mostly by diplomats and high nobles who had spent months wrangling over its terms. But its significance was immense. Here, before God and men, France and England proclaimed a truce embodied in a girl who had barely lost her milk teeth. A year later came the second spectacle, Isabella's coronation in Westminster Abbey. If Calais had been the quiet seal on a treaty, Westminster was the full roar of English pageantry, meant to dazzle subjects and foreign observers alike. The child queen, now 8, was carried through the streets of London in a litter draped with roses of England and fleurs-de-lis of France, her crown fashioned small enough to rest upon her still-growing head. Londoners thronged the streets, driven by curiosity more than loyalty. Rumours had flown for months. The king had taken a bride so young she could hardly speak English. A French princess brought to England in place of war. Some grumbled at the match, muttering that Richard preferred peace to conquest. Others came simply to stare, to see with their own eyes the child destined to wear the crown of England. Chroniclers claim that the crowds were so dense in the abbey that several people were crushed to death in the press of bodies. Inside, the spectacle unfolded with all the weight of centuries. Westminster's soaring Gothic arches, gilded altars, and flickering candles dwarfed the small figure at its centre. Isabella processed to the high altar, her train carried by duchesses who towered over her like guardians. When the archbishop placed the crown upon her head, it seemed almost grotesque in scale, an artifact of monarchy resting on a child's fragile brow. The feast that followed lasted 3 days, overflowing with jugglers, musicians, and elaborate performances. Actors staged allegories of England and France reconciled, while nobles toasted the peace that this marriage promised. Yet even amid the celebration, a strange tension lingered. The nobles feasted and laughed, but behind their eyes lay calculation. Would this truce endure? Would this child one day become a true queen, or simply another pawn swept aside when politics shifted? Isabella herself played her role with astonishing composure. She smiled when prompted, bowed when required, and sat beside Richard at the high table, nibbling carefully at her food, while courtiers studied her every gesture. She was too young to understand that her very presence was a symbol proof that the king had chosen diplomacy over conquest. That peace was possible if both sides willed it. And yet, for all its grandeur, the coronation could not still the doubts of those who saw weakness in Richard's bargain. Many of England's great lords muttered that the king was too pliant, too willing to bow to France. Peace, they insisted, was but a pause before inevitable war. For now, though, the child queen had done her duty. She had walked the marble aisles, endured the crushing weight of a golden crown, smiled at a people who did not yet accept her. In the eyes of God and of Europe, Isabella of Valois was now Queen of England. But beneath the layers of silk and ritual, she remained what she always had been. A child, far from home, playing a role scripted by men who would never ask what she wanted. In the months that followed her coronation, Isabella's life shifted from ceremony to routine. Though routine in a royal palace was a delicate balance of discipline, spectacle, and constant surveillance, Westminster Palace became her new home. Its sprawling maze of chambers and courtyards both shelter and prison. For a girl not yet 9, the world had already narrowed to tapestries, tutors, and the whispers of courtiers who saw her less as a child and more as a symbol. Richard II had promised, and written into the treaty itself, that the marriage would not be consummated until Isabella reached maturity. In the meantime, she was to be raised, educated, and moulded into a queen who would embody both French birth and English loyalty. To this end, her household was carefully constructed, a blend of French ladies-in-waiting who spoke her language and soothed her homesickness, and English attendants charged with immersing her in the customs of her adopted kingdom. Her days were shaped by lessons. Tutors drilled her in both French and English, teaching her not only the language, but also the subtleties of English pronunciation that marked one's place in court. She learned to curtsy in the English style, to dine with the dignity of a queen, to wear the proper colours on feast days, to show both humility and majesty in every gesture. She was taught to choose wine over ale at meals, for ale was thought vulgar among the nobility, and to recognise the coats of arms of England's great families. Richard himself took an unusual interest in her upbringing. He visited her apartments regularly, often bringing gifts, exotic birds from Ireland, books copied in Oxford, musical instruments crafted by the finest London artisans. Contemporary chroniclers noted the tenderness with which he spoke to her, never as a man to his wife, but as a guardian to his ward. Some even remarked that Richard seemed rejuvenated in her presence, finding comfort in the innocence of a child, untouched by the betrayals of politics. For Isabella, who had grown up amid her father's violent fits of madness, this gentle attention must have felt strangely secure. And yet, even within the safety of her chambers, the atmosphere of politics seeped into her life. Medieval royal courts were not places where children were sheltered from intrigue. They were training grounds where loyalty, gossip, and ambition were absorbed as naturally as language. Alongside her, other children of noble birth were raised boys and girls, sent by their families to be educated near the throne, their futures intertwined with royal favour. Among these companions, Isabella found particular friendship with Margaret Holland, daughter of Richard's half-brother. Margaret was only a few years older, but to Isabella she seemed a guide, teaching her English children's games, explaining the complex hierarchies of noble families, and whispering secrets about which ladies could be trusted. The two spent hours together in Isabella's private garden, stitching embroidery, sharing stories, and piecing together the genealogies of England's fractious nobility. Through Margaret's eyes, Isabella began to glimpse the fault lines of English politics. She noticed how conversations in great halls would hush when Richard entered, how certain lords carried themselves with stiff resentment rather than deference, how alliances and enmities were mapped into every feast and festival. To a child raised amid her father's madness, these tensions had a familiar scent, the instability of power, the danger of sudden change. Yet there were moments when Isabella could simply be a child. In the gardens of Westminster, she laughed as she chased butterflies with Margaret. At night, she listened as her French governess told stories of saints and dragons, of Charlemagne and Roland, of a France she was beginning to forget. In those hours, the crown weighed less heavily, but even then, she was never entirely free. Every gesture was watched, every word judged as a sign of what sort of queen she might become. It was a strange duality. By day, Isabella was drilled in the poise of a monarch, her childhood compressed into lessons on how to survive in a court where misstep meant ruin. By night, she clutched dolls in her bedchamber, her small hands trembling when storms rattled the leaded windows. Richard encouraged her education beyond the usual accomplishments expected of noble girls. He ordered that she be taught history, geography, and scripture, as though preparing her not only for the role of queen, but for the possibility of ruling as a partner. Chroniclers speak of his delight when she pointed to a map of France and England and traced the narrow channel with her finger. "This water divides us," her tutor explained, "yet it also binds us." Isabella, still a child, nodded solemnly as though understanding more than her years allowed, but even as she absorbed her new world, shadows gathered on the horizon. In these early years of peace, Isabella felt herself becoming more English, more at home within Westminster's walls. Yet beyond the palace, dissatisfaction with Richard simmered, and the very nobles who feasted at Isabella's coronation were beginning to plot. For the girl queen, these years of quiet education and guarded companionship would prove fleeting a fragile calm before a storm that would soon tear apart both her world and her kings. For Isabella, the years 1397 and 1398 passed with deceptive calm. She grew taller, her English grew fluent, and the stone corridors of Westminster that once felt alien began to feel like home. Richard still visited her often, presenting her with trinkets and books, guiding her with a paternal hand. In her childish eyes, the king was a constant, a figure of gentleness who seemed immune to the turbulence that had plagued her father's court in Paris. But beneath the glittering ceremonies and the royal feasts, England itself was cracking. Richard's nobles, long resentful of his favoritism and extravagance, whispered in dark halls. They accused him of being too lenient with France, too enamored with peace, when England's military strength was still considerable. Others grumbled at his reliance on close companions, whom he elevated above more powerful lords. These murmurs of discontent would soon swell into a storm. The shift became apparent to Isabella in small, unsettling ways. Her English attendants grew more tense. Conversations that once carried laughter now ended abruptly when she entered the room. Margaret Holland, usually bright and reassuring, seemed distracted, her voice hushed when she spoke of her family. Isabella may not have understood the details, but she could sense what all children sense when the adults around them are afraid. Something was coming. The truth was that Richard had made a dangerous move the year before. In 1397, he struck against the Lords Appellant, the powerful nobles who had once challenged his rule, executing or exiling several of them. Among those banished was his cousin, Henry Bolingbroke, Duke of Hereford, son of John of Gaunt. At first, Richard's boldness secured his authority, but it also created enemies who waited for their moment. That moment came in 1399. When John of Gaunt died, Bolingbroke should have inherited his vast Lancastrian estates. Instead, Richard seized them for the crown. It was an act of greed, or perhaps desperation, for his treasury was strained. But in stripping Bolingbroke of his birthright, Richard signed his own death warrant. News spread quickly. Henry Bolingbroke had landed in Yorkshire with an army. At first he claimed he came only to reclaim his inheritance, but it became clear he meant more. Nobles, weary of Richard's rule, flocked to his banner. Power shifted with alarming speed. Isabella experienced this upheaval, not through proclamations, but through fear. One morning she awoke to find half her English attendants gone. By afternoon she heard shouts in the courtyards, the clatter of unfamiliar livery as new soldiers arrived. That evening, Margaret Holland burst into her chambers, her face pale. "We must leave," she whispered. "Pack what you can. The king orders it." The destination chilled Isabella, the Tower of London. She had heard of it. Of course, part fortress, part palace, part prison. To be sent there meant safety, but also danger. The tower was where queens had waited for coronations, but also where they had awaited executions. As her litter rattled through the dark London streets, flanked by armed men, Isabella must have pressed her face to the curtains, hearing not the hum of merchants, but the fearful silence of a city bracing for change. Within the tower, her apartments were comfortable but unmistakably confining. Guards stood at every entrance. Her windows were barred. Her French ladies remained with her, but most of her English companions were dismissed. For the first time since leaving Paris, Isabella felt truly alone. It was here, in those stone walls, that Richard came to her for what would be their last intimate conversation. He looked altered, unkempt, his clothes rumpled, his eyes hollow with exhaustion. The confident king, who had once guided her gently through ceremonies, now seemed like a man haunted. "My dear child," he told her, kneeling beside her as he had when they first met. "Our world is changing. There are those who question my right to rule. They mean to unseat me." "Are you still king?" Isabella asked. The question was simple, but it carried the bluntness of youth. "For now," Richard replied with a bitter smile, "but Henry has many supporters, and I cannot protect you as I once could." For the first time, Richard spoke to her not as a child, but as a political equal. He explained that Henry Bolingbroke claimed the throne, that lords were deserting him, that the peace with France now hung in the balance. Isabella, barely 9, listened with a solemnity that unnerved even him. She understood, dimly, that her life had become a pawn in a game she could neither control nor escape. Not long after, the tower gates opened to men in new livery. Soldiers bearing the badge of the Red Rose escorted her chambers. And then appeared Henry Bolingbroke himself, now styled Henry IV, the new King of England. Tall, commanding, eyes sharp with calculation, he studied the girl before him. Isabella rose, curtsied deeply, as her tutors had drilled into her, and waited. Henry regarded her in silence. Here stood a child who was also a queen, a French princess, who could either soothe or inflame tensions with her homeland. "Your Grace," he said at last, still granting her the title of queen, "circumstances require that we discuss your future." Richard was gone. Isabella did not yet know if he lived or died, but her world had shifted. She was no longer the cherished ward of a king who treated her gently. She was now the possession of a usurper who weighed her worth not as a child, but as a bargaining chip. For Isabella, the gilded innocence of her early years in England had ended. What lay ahead was far darker. A childhood lived under watch, a fate tethered to men who saw her as leverage in the brutal Game of Thrones. With Richard gone, and Henry IV seated on the throne, Isabella's world shrank to the walls of the Tower of London. She was not formally imprisoned, but neither was she free. To the new king, she was not a girl with dark, searching eyes, she was leverage. A pawn in the fragile game of peace with France, her days settled into an eerie stillness. Guards in red rose livery stood at every entrance, their armour clinking whenever she moved between chambers. The barred windows let in only slivers of grey London sky. Her French ladies-in-waiting remained, their presence a fragile comfort, while nearly all her English attendants were dismissed. It was as though Henry had stripped away every tie she had built in her new homeland, leaving her surrounded only by reminders of the country she had left at 6. In council chambers, men debated her fate. Some urged Henry to send her back at once. Why waste coin keeping a child queen who could no longer strengthen his rule? Others advised caution. Isabella's presence in England gave Henry bargaining power. As long as she remained in his custody, her father, Charles VI of France, would hesitate to break the truce. For now, Henry chose the middle path. Isabella would be kept in comfort, treated with respect, but never trusted. What astonished courtiers was the dignity with which the child bore herself. Isabella greeted Henry's men politely, never insolent, never visibly afraid, yet she carried herself with a regal composure far beyond her years. She insisted on being addressed as Queen, reminding all who spoke with her that she was Richard's lawful wife. It was not childish stubbornness, it was survival. In holding fast to her title, Isabella preserved the only shield she had against being dismissed as an inconvenient orphan of politics. But the illusion of security shattered when whispers of Richard's fate reached her. First came rumours. The deposed king had died in captivity. Then darker murmurs that his death had not been natural, that Henry's men had ensured it. When confirmation arrived, the blow struck Isabella with unexpected force. She had not loved Richard in the way a wife loves a husband. She had been too young for that, but he had been kind to her, protective, even fatherly. In his absence, she had felt vulnerable. In his presence, she had felt safe. Now, even that fragile anchor was gone. Chroniclers wrote that Isabella wept bitterly, retreating into silence for days. But her grief was not only personal. She understood, dimly but clearly, what Richard's death meant. If Henry could rid himself of an anointed king, what protection could a French child offer herself? If Richard, crowned and consecrated, could be cast aside and erased, how much easier would it be to erase her? And so Isabella learned her first hard lesson in survival. Her worth lay not in who she was, but in what she symbolized. To France, she was the daughter of Charles VI, a token of peace. To England, she was a bargaining chip, a reminder that the truce still bound them to their rival. Her own wishes, her own childhood, mattered little. Her ladies counselled her carefully. "Remember, Your Grace," Madame de Coucy whispered, "you are still Queen of England in the eyes of God and France. Hold to that, no matter what they tell you. So long as they dare not strip you of that name, you are safe." It was a fragile hope, but hope nonetheless. Meanwhile, beyond the tower, the streets of London hummed with unease. The people muttered about Richard's death, some whispering of foul play. Henry's reign was still unsteady, his crown not yet secure. Isabella felt it in the way her guards avoided her gaze, in the way her attendants spoke in half-sentences, in the way the court seemed to hold its breath. She was 9 years old. 9 and already a widow, a prisoner, and a bargaining piece between two kingdoms. Her dolls lay forgotten in a chest. Her lessons in embroidery seemed laughable distractions. Instead, she listened at doors, read the fear in her lady's eyes, and began to understand that her very survival depended on how well she could play the role assigned to her. No longer merely the child who had smiled at her coronation, Isabella of Valois was awakening to the truth of her position. She was not free, but neither was she powerless. A pawn, yes, but a pawn who knew that in the right moment, even the smallest piece on the board could change the game. By the dawn of the new century, Isabella's captivity had become a quiet standoff between England and France. Henry IV held her in comfortable confinement, a symbol of his leverage. to release her outright was to lose a bargaining chip. To keep her indefinitely risked provoking the Valois court. In early 1400, Henry's council delivered an ultimatum. Isabella would be allowed to return home, but only if she acknowledged Henry as the rightful king of England and renounced any claim to the English throne as Richard's widow. For Henry, it was a neat solution if she consented. It would erase the awkward bond that still tethered England to Richard's legacy. For Isabella, not yet 11, the choice was agonizing. To return meant safety, reunion with her family, escape from the grey stone walls of the Tower. But to return on Henry's terms meant erasing 3 years of her life, disowning her title as queen, and betraying the memory of the only man who had shown her gentleness in England. She wrestled with the decision in silence, torn between loyalty to Richard's ghost and the desperate yearning for home. The matter was decided for her when word came from Paris. During a rare lucid spell, her father, Charles VI, demanded her return at once. The message was blunt. If Isabella were not released, France would regard it as an act of hostility, a breach of the fragile truce. Faced with the threat of renewed war, Henry relented. In the summer of 1401, Isabella's small convoy crossed the Channel. Her departure was quiet, without the fanfare of her arrival. No jubilant crowds pressed to see her off. No nobles crowded the docks. For England, her presence had been a political tool, not a source of affection. And so the little queen slipped away almost as silently as she had arrived, a chapter in English history already being closed. For Isabella, the journey home was anything but simple. She had spent nearly half her life in England. She now spoke French with an English lilt, preferred English fashions, and bowed in English style. She was no longer the 6-year-old princess who had left Paris clutching dolls. She returned as a young woman of 11, still a child, but with the eyes of one who had seen both crowns and cages. The reunion at the French court was bittersweet. Her father was deep in the throes of his illness, unable to recognize her. On her arrival, Charles raved about invisible enemies, mistook courtiers for assassins, and recoiled from his daughter as though she were a stranger. Her mother, Queen Isabeau, embraced her warmly, but her eyes glittered with calculation. Isabella was not simply her child restored, she was a widow of England, a valuable asset in the dangerous game of French diplomacy. The court itself was no haven. France seethed with factional rivalries. The Armagnacs and Burgundians jostled for influence, each seeking to control the government while the king remained incapacitated. In this divided world, Isabella's experiences in England gave her a peculiar power. She carried memories of English politics, whispers of noble allegiances, and a first-hand sense of her late husband's kingdom. To her mother and her mother's allies, this knowledge was worth as much as gold. Yet for Isabella, her return was not triumph, but dislocation. Paris, once her cradle, felt strange. Her childhood toys no longer mattered. The language was familiar, but carried different cadences than she remembered. She was French by birth, but half English by experience, and belonged wholly to neither. Still, she carried herself with the composure she had learned in Westminster. At banquets she bowed gracefully, answered her mother's probing questions carefully, and spoke of England without bitterness, but without betraying its secrets. She could not hate the land where she had been crowned, tutored, and gently protected by Richard, but neither could she claim it as her own. At night, when the torches burned low in the Louvre's corridors, Isabella must have thought of the gardens at Westminster, where she had laughed with Margaret Holland, of the maps she studied with her tutors, of Richard's last visit in the Tower. She was no longer his queen, but she remained his widow, and in that identity lay both sorrow and strength. She had survived England. Now she would have to survive France. And in this court, where factions sharpened daggers in the shadows, her past would become both shield and weapon. Isabella's return to France might have seemed, on the surface, a restoration. The lost daughter reunited with her family, safe at last from English intrigues. But to Isabella herself, Life in Paris was a different kind of captivity. She was no longer the child queen in gilded English halls, but neither was she simply a princess of France. She was the widow of England, her very existence a reminder of treaties, broken promises, and a king brought down by betrayal. The French court eyed her with mixed feelings. To some, she was valuable living proof of England's duplicity, a figure who could be wielded in diplomatic arguments. To others, she was dangerous, carrying sympathies shaped by years in Westminster. At just 12 years old, she had already acquired the air of someone who belonged to two kingdoms, and yet to neither. Isabella herself began to cultivate caution. When courtiers questioned her about Henry IV, she answered politely but vaguely. When asked about English defences or the loyalties of its nobles, she offered general truths but nothing that might endanger the people she had once lived among. Some accused her of divided loyalties, but others admired her restraint, seeing in her the beginnings of a political mind. Her mother, Queen Isabeau, wasted no time in considering the next step, remarriage. A girl of noble blood, especially one who had been Queen of England, could not remain unwed for long. In the eyes of Europe's dynasties, Isabella was still a prize, a symbol who could cement alliances. At first, some French courtiers whispered of sending her back to England, perhaps to marry Henry IV himself or one of his sons. The suggestion horrified Isabella. To wed the usurper who had deposed Richard, the man whose crown was bought at her husband's expense, was unthinkable. She reportedly replied, in words remembered by chroniclers, "I will not marry the man who made me a widow." It was a declaration both childish and profound, showing the steel beneath her youthful grace. The true solution came from closer to home, Charles of Orléans, her cousin. At 29, he was nearly twice her age, but he was no stranger. Isabella had seen him at court, a refined man known for his love of poetry, music, and learning. Unlike the grim warriors who dominated France's factions, Charles cultivated the image of a patron, a man who cherished culture as much as power. For Isabella, who had been treated by Richard more as a daughter than a wife, the idea of a husband who valued her mind as well as her lineage carried unexpected appeal. The negotiations proceeded quickly. Politically, the match was ideal. By marrying Charles, Isabella's value as a diplomatic pawn would remain within the French royal house, rather than risk being claimed by a foreign power. For Charles, marrying the former Queen of England strengthened his prestige and drew him closer to the crown. But what surprised many observers was Isabella's own acceptance. At 14, she was no longer a child. The years in England had forced her to grow quickly, and she had formed her own views of marriage. She wanted a partner, not merely a master. Charles, with his gentleness and cultured bearing, seemed capable of offering that. Unlike Richard, who had knelt to speak softly to her as a guardian, Charles looked at her directly, as though she were an equal. "I seek not the Queen of England," he reportedly told her in private, "but Isabella, the woman who endured and yet remained unbroken." Their wedding in June 1406 was everything her marriage to Richard had not been. Where her first wedding had been hushed and diplomatic, this one was a grand celebration at the Cathedral of Notre Dame in Paris. Bells rang across the city, nobles in silks and jewels crowded the nave, and choirs lifted their voices to the vaulted ceiling. Isabella, now 16, walked with confidence. Her gown of deep blue silk, embroidered with golden fleurs-de-lis shimmering in the candlelight. Her crown of sapphires and pearls sat naturally on her brow, no longer an absurd weight on a child's head, but a fitting emblem of a young woman who had grown into her role. When she and Charles exchanged vows, they looked directly at one another not as strangers bound by treaty, but as two people who, against all odds, had found a measure of choice in lives shaped by politics. Chroniclers noted that their voices were steady and that their eyes did not waver. The wedding feast that followed dazzled even the jaded Parisians. Troubadours sang ballads of love conquering adversity. Actors staged allegories of peace, and the finest wines flowed. Unlike the stiff banquets of Westminster, this was a celebration in which Isabella seemed at ease. She laughed, she danced, she joined in conversation with poets and scholars who gathered around her. In her new household, Isabella flourished. At Charles's court in Blois, she became a patron of the arts, encouraging poets, musicians, and illuminators. She commissioned manuscripts, fostered scholars, and built a small circle of intellectuals who valued her insight as much as her rank. The little girl who once traced maps in Westminster now discussed poetry, philosophy, and politics with the brightest minds of her age. Soon, motherhood followed. In 1407, she gave birth to a daughter, Jeannie. Unlike her own childhood, fractured by fear and absence, Isabella insisted on being present. She nursed her daughter herself, against the advice of physicians who deemed it unfit for a duchess. For Isabella, it was not only an act of love, but a vow. Her child would know safety, affection, and the constancy she herself had been denied. It seemed, at last, that Isabella had carved out a life of her own, choosing a life not of treaties and pawns, but of companionship, culture, and motherhood. Yet even as she tasted happiness, France itself began to fracture under the weight of civil war. The same forces of ambition and violence that had torn Richard from his throne now stalked her second marriage. For Isabella, the lesson was becoming clear. Peace was always fragile, and joy always temporary, in a world where crowns were bought with blood. The first years of Isabella's marriage to Charles of Orléans were, by every account, the happiest of her brief life. Charles adored her, not only as a duchess who bolstered his political stature, but as a partner who shared his love of poetry, song, and the refinements of courtly culture. Their residence at Blois became a sanctuary of art and learning, drawing poets and scholars who found in Isabella not merely a patroness, but an intelligent, engaged voice. For a girl who had once sat silently in the Tower of London, defined only by what others made of her, the transformation was remarkable. She was finally shaping her own identity. Motherhood deepened this sense of fulfillment. In 1407, Isabella gave birth to her first child, Jean, and unlike most noble mothers of her time, she insisted on nursing the infant herself. Chroniclers tell us she dismissed her physician's disapproval with quiet determination. For Isabella, this was more than maternal instinct, it was an act of defiance, proof that she could make choices for her own body and her own family, rather than bow to convention. To hold her daughter, to whisper to her in both French and English, was to reclaim something she had lost when her own childhood had been surrendered to politics. But France was not a land that allowed peace to linger. In November 1407, Charles's father, Louis, Duke of Orléans, was assassinated on the streets of Paris by the agents of the Duke of Burgundy. The murder ripped France into factions, plunging the kingdom into civil war between the Orleanists and the Burgundians. Isabella, barely 18, found herself thrust, once again, into the violent heart of politics. The courtly music of Blois was drowned out by the clash of steel. For Charles, the assassination lit a fire of vengeance. For Isabella, it was a familiar nightmare, the spectre of violence returning to consume her family, just as it had swallowed Richard's England. She adapted quickly, stepping into a new role. When Charles went to campaign, she managed estates, oversaw supplies, and negotiated with allies. She was no longer a symbol to be manipulated, but an active participant in the survival of her house. Letters from this period show her clear-headed, practical, and compassionate pleading for safe passage for refugees, ordering aid for the wounded, urging moderation where others cried for blood. Her compassion became her hallmark. Among the common people of France, Isabella gained a reputation not only as the Duchess of Orléans, but as a woman who remembered the suffering of those beneath the nobility. She had lived as a child hostage, as a pawn. She knew the cruelty of being used by powers larger than oneself, and so she sought to use what power she had to soften the blows of war, even when she could not stop it. Yet happiness was fleeting. In 1408, Isabella gave birth to a son, Charles, securing her family's line. But a year later, with the birth of her daughter Marguerite, disaster struck. Complications left Isabella gravely weakened. Medieval medicine offered little hope. She lingered in illness, her body frail, her strength diminished. Her doctors warned her that another pregnancy would kill her. She was barely 20, yet already her health bore the scars of political marriages, repeated childbirths, and the unrelenting strain of war. Even as her body failed, her mind did not. Isabella continued to oversee her household, to guide her children's early education, and to advise Charles in his political struggles, but those around her saw the signs. Chroniclers describe her as pale, coughing, plagued by fevers that left her bedridden for weeks at a time. Some modern historians suspect tuberculosis, the wasting disease that claimed so many young lives in the medieval world. On the 13th of September, 1409, Isabella of Valois died. She was only 20 years old. Her death sent ripples across France. Charles was devastated. He had not only lost a wife, but a companion of rare intelligence and sensitivity. His grief would shape his poetry and his politics for years to come. At her funeral procession through Paris, mourners wept openly. Nobles, clerics, and commoners alike gathered to honor the young woman who had embodied both the fragility and the resilience of her age. Her body was laid to rest at the Celestine convent in Paris, among other royals, but her memory lingered far beyond the walls of the church. Isabella's legacy lived in her children, most notably her son Charles, who would become one of France's most celebrated poets, carrying forward the love of language and art his mother had nurtured. Her daughters would make advantageous marriages, strengthening the Orléans line. Yet, beyond dynastic success, Isabella's true legacy was something less tangible, yet more enduring. The example of a woman who had been forced into history's most merciless roles, and yet carved a space for compassion, dignity, and courage. To modern eyes, the image of a 6-year-old girl married to a 29-year-old king is shocking. We recoil at the thought of childhood so abruptly stolen, but to dwell only on that dissonance risks missing what Isabella achieved within the brutal constraints of her time. She was born a pawn, but she refused to remain one. She became a queen, a duchess, a mother, and most of all a human being who sought to shape her own life amid the machinery of war and power. Her story is not a tragedy alone, though it ended young. It is a reminder of how history's forgotten figures, especially women written off as footnotes, often carried within them the quiet strength to endure, adapt, and leave their mark. Isabella of Valois' life may have been short, but in those 20 years, she lived through exile, widowhood, captivity, motherhood, and war. She bore each with resilience, her memory haunting the chronicles not as a victim, but as a symbol of endurance in an age when even kings were not safe from ruin. In her, we glimpse a truth that echoes across centuries. Power may shape lives, but it does not always define them.